Hello, good morning. Before starting, I would like to thank the organizers Ysaÿe and Eva for allowing me to give this presentation. My name is Joanna Staruch-Smolec. I'm a PhD student at Université Libre and Conservatoire Royal of Brussels, under a fellowship of the Belgian Fund of Scientific Research, FNRS. This paper focuses on violin portamento as an expressive slide between two notes. It occurs when two notes are connected by at least some of the intermediate pitches in an audible way. We can use different fingerings on a given portamento to achieve multiple audible results. And before entering into analysis of Ysaÿe's portamento, I would like to show a few basic types of portamento to give you a hint of how it can sound. Let's use the example of a connection between E and A. We can play both notes and the slide with one single finger like this. This is usually categorized as the first type of portamento. The second type is when the two notes are played by different fingers. Then we can slide with the first finger, with the finger which plays the first note. It is often called the beginning finger portamento, type 2B, since this term has been used in English translation of the violin treatise of Carl Flesch, The Art of Violin Playing, which became a reference for the 20th century violinists and researchers. And then we can also use the finger which plays the second note to slide, which is called the last finger portamento following Flesch's terms again, type 2L. It's been shown by the researchers in the performance practice domain that the portamento was a crucial device for the violin expression in the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. It was used not only more frequently, but also in a more pronounced manner than today's practice. Belgian virtuoso, violin virtuoso Eugène Ysaÿe, is often given as an example of highly diverse use of portamento. Carl Flesch mentions in his memoirs that Ysaÿe's portamentos were novel and entrancing. Portamento is one of Ysaÿe's gestures that I intended to study in my PhD, exploring his library and recordings. But quite quickly in the process, I've been confronted with lots of difficulties concerning interpretations of the sources. The recorded sound gives an audible result of Ysaÿe's portamentos, but it's not easy to understand how they were produced in terms of fingerings. The annotations give the fingerings, but it's hard to know what exact audible result was meant to be obtained. It's not obvious if the portamento was intended at all, and if yes, what kind. Therefore, I decided to do this comparative study of the recording and annotated violin part of the Walters Preislied from the Wagner's opera Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, which was arranged for violin and piano by August Wilhelmi. I wanted to better connect the fingerings with the audible results to build a ground for further investigation of other scores and recordings. The Preislied is one of the 14 short pieces recorded by Ysaÿe in the with Camille de Creuse in December 1912 in Columbia Studio, New York. I used a digital transfer of this disc made by Sony in 1996. The score on which I was working is held in Juilliard School in the collection of Ysaÿe's student and second wife, Jeannette Dansin. We could see her photo on the previous slide here. In her collection, we can find a general score and two violin parts of the analyzed piece. They all have some markings, but one of the violin parts is annotated very generously. Ray Iwaizumi, who prepared an annotated catalog of this collection, claims that these annotations are probably by Ysaÿe's hand, and my study of Ysaÿe's library held in Belgian institutions support this view. I also suppose that he worked on the score around the time of the recording session. It was edited in 1909, 3 years before the recording, and the cuts on the three scores of Jeannette's collection correspond with the sections omitted on the recording, which is a common practice to keep it at 5 minutes long in line with the technical limitation of the time. These cards are quite extensive. They represent 1/5 of the bars in the piece, so it seems quite unlikely that Ysaÿe would mark them on the score for any purpose other than the recording context. But even if Ysaÿe actually played from the score during the recording and the fingerings were annotated before or during the session, it wouldn't necessarily mean that he played the same fingerings. So the study needed a very carefully planned methodology to avoid bias and misconceptions as much as possible. I started by analyzing the recording. I marked the audible slides. I analyzed them using Sonic Visualiser software, and then I tried to deduce the fingerings. This often felt a bit like Sudoku. Sometimes an interval few bits earlier or later implied use of certain fingerings for a given portamento. The next step was merging the fingerings from the score. I took those annotated by Ysaÿe, filled in the gaps with printed ones, and for the rest, I tried to deduce the most possible scenario. These two steps allowed me to compare the fingerings on the portamentos. If they were the same, great. I thought my analysis was confirmed. If different, I continued the investigation. This time I compared the audible results. I experimented with the fingerings from the score on the violin to see if a result similar to the one recorded by Ysaÿe could be possibly achieved using them. If not, then Ysaÿe has clearly used different fingerings from Annotated. If yes, I came back to Sonic Visualiser to reanalyze the recording. If I concluded then that in fact Ysaÿe could have played the annotated version, this allowed me to make some changes to my techniques of recording analysis. If the results were very similar, but after the second analysis, I concluded the fingerings were different, that meant that Ysaÿe maintained the same performing idea, but modified the means by which he achieved it. So in total, I found 127 portamentos in the recording. In more than 2/3 of them, 69% in total, Ysaÿe used the same fingerings and annotated. In the first comparison, 61 of the cases were classified as being the same. A further 8% of the cases appeared to be the same after the re-examination. In the remaining cases, approximately a third, Ysaÿe used the different fingerings, but in half of these portamentos, here, he maintained a similar audible result. Let's move to some examples. I've used the spectrogram provided by Sonic Visualiser, which shows the frequencies of sound in time. The color variation shows the intensity of sound from dark green for soft to orange for loud. This provides an important visual aid. Sonic Visualiser allows also to slow down and listen more in detail. An important part of this process was also violin experimentation. I was trying out every passage, and I also recorded different versions of the same passage to check how a specific portamento resulting from my analysis sounds and looks. This short passage provides examples of 4 portamento types most frequently used by Ysaÿe. They cover more than 90% of all cases identified in Pricelit. Let's listen to this passage first. Three of these portamentos are the basic types explained in the beginning of this presentation. Here we have the single finger portamento. If it's played on one bow with constant pressure, and then we get this nice smooth line between the notes. Here we have an example of the B portamento. So the first finger slides from B to D. Then there is a gap, and the second finger plays E. Here we have an example of the L portamento. It starts with an open string A, and then the first finger slides on the E string from G to A. In the classic version of these portamentos, the fingers on the two notes follow the natural order. If you wanted to slide up from the second finger, we would go to the third or fourth. If you wanted to slide it down from the second finger, we would go to the first. A much less studied variation of the B portamento occurs when we slide to what I call the preceding finger. Like in this example, where the first finger slides from D to B before the second finger plays C. Flesch mentions this option, and he warns that the intermediate note should never be heard. But Ysaÿe often exceeds the actual interval, like here, in an audible way, which adds a particular flavor to this portamento. So I propose to listen to this short passage of Ysaÿe's recording again. You can see the fingerings that I recorded here, that I suppose are played by Ysaÿe. Here is a simplified graphic of these four types most often used by Ysaÿe, configurations used by him in this piece. So we have a single finger portamento, and then portamento with a following finger. In the beginning finger option, he plays it up and down, and in the last finger option he doesn't play. I didn't find an example of the descending portamento, and the preceding finger portamentos look like this. Another type of portamento is so-called BL portamento, where the slide starts with the beginning finger here and finishes with the last finger. So we have the gap in the middle of the slide. Using the example of the portamento between E and A, it can sound like this. In Presley, Ysaÿe uses it only once in the classical following finger form, but he uses it 6 times in the preceding finger mode, which creates yet different color. In this example here, he slides with the second finger from C to around C sharp, and then he retakes with the first finger from a little bit lower to slide until D. I choose this passage also to give examples of portamentos from and to an open string or harmonic, which are interesting variations of B and L portamento. In the case of B and L portamento, we can see a gap in the slide in the spectrogram, like here, for example. Sonic Visualiser allows to measure approximately the intermediate note that I marked on white, which helps the determination of the fingers used. In my first analysis, I assumed that the break corresponds with a standard distance between the fingers, as it is often shown in the musical examples given in the violin schools. So in this B portamento, here, the first finger slides from B to D, and so the E should be played with the second finger. But let's imagine that the first finger slid only to C, then I would assume that the E was played with the third finger. And this way of counting was working very well in most of cases, but the confrontation with annotations has shown that Ysaÿe stretched sometimes his fingers further than in the standard position. And it applies not only to the high positions, where the intervals get much smaller and it's usual to cover bigger distances with the fingers, but also to the low ones. For example, in this portamento between D and G, which sounds like this in Ysaÿe's recording. The intermediate note is F, which suggests the use of the third finger, like this. But the annotations show the second finger. And indeed, trying it out on the violin, I remarked that the stretched second finger is much more suitable to achieve this very soft, delicate result recorded by Ysaÿe. So it seems quite straightforward that the gap in the slide means the change of finger, right? Actually, no. It appears to be more complicated. Here's an interesting example. The L portamento was often associated with the Franco-Belgian school of violin playing, and Ysaÿe is frequently quoted as its pioneer. And at the first listening, the El Portamento seems quite present in the recording, but my analyses have shown that there's only 3 portamentos really played with the last finger. And this is because in other 6 cases, these portamentos are played with single finger, but the bow changes in the beginning of the slide, like this, which sounds like the El Portamento. Here is this kind of portamento in the context of the very first phrase of the piece. In this passage, there is also a nice example of another special case, the portamento without shifting between the positions. It's of course impossible to know what exactly Ysaÿe does because we don't have a video recording of this piece, but it seems very plausible to me that he leaves his hand in a third position when he's here, and he stretches his third finger to the fourth position before sliding back to the third position with the third finger. It sounds like this. One more remark here is that it's often quite hard to differentiate between the single finger portamento and the preceding finger portamento. It's not easy to know if a little gap in the slide represents the change of finger, the change of bow, or maybe a variation in the pressure of one or the other. In many cases, I succeeded in determining the most probable type by analyzing the context and trying out on the violin, but I had to leave 2 cases unresolved. Another challenge was to differentiate between the purely technical slides and the portamentos which were meant to be audible. At some point, I went too much into detail, listening slowly and analyzing the spectrogram very closely. But when I took some distance, the slides appeared to be almost imperceptible in normal tempo. This graphic represents the percentage of different portamento types used by Ysaÿe in Preislied. The single finger portamento is dominant. Next comes the B portamento in a classic following finger form. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is quite typical for the performance practice of Ysaÿe's times. And in today's practice, we would use them most often too. But the presence of 13% of the B portamento with a preceding finger is quite surprising, given the fact that this type is not studied a lot in the literature. In addition, Ysaÿe often plays the intermediate note quite audibly. Today, we would rather try to play this kind of slide as discreetly as possible. Other types of portamento are used less frequently by Ysaÿe, but it seems to me that the novel and entrancing character of his portamento, as described by Flesch, as I mentioned in the beginning, lies to a certain extent in the variety of these lesser known types. This case study allowed me to dig into the fascinating world of Ysaÿe's portamento. It helped me to adapt the existing typology of portamento to the specific case of Ysaÿe's gestures. It also provoked a revision of the techniques used for the analysis of the recordings and annotations, which gives a ground for further investigation of other sources, recordings, and scores. The fingerings are only one of many variables defining the portamento, and I'm planning to investigate others, like timing, shape, emphasis, which can help in further understanding of Ysaÿe's portamento phenomenon. Thank you very much for your attention.